The city of Halifax has a long and colorful history, but some of its history has been overlooked. For 40 years, from the 1940s to the 1980s, everyone was talking about Ada McCallum. She had school children buzzing, mothers wagging their fingers, and men of power smirking smugly. This is the story of Nova Scotia's famous madam, Ada McCallum. Ask anyone from Nova Scotia about Ada, and they've almost all heard of her.
She had a lot of weight in circles that no one could really understand at the time.
Ada was a part of our cultural life. She was a great tourist attraction, her and her girls.
She was self-employed.
If you can believe the stories, Ada's business was known around the world. It was reported that a billboard in a stadium in Tokyo provided traveling businessmen and fishermen a number to call when in Nova Scotia. Elizabeth Owen, an illustrator, never actually met Ada.
I was a student, and I was walking down Barrington Street in Halifax, and I was approached by two Russian sailors, and one of them asked me, in heavy Russian accent, where Ada lived. And it took me aback because although everyone in Halifax, it seemed, knew Ada, I didn't know where she lived. I didn't know what area of town she was even in. And I said, I didn't know, but how did he know about her? And apparently it was written on the washroom wall in this small town in Russian for a good time called Ada in Halifax, which I thought was really interesting.
The woman who became such a celebrity had humble beginnings. The Piper family had emigrated from England, and eventually the young family moved west to a farm in Manitoba. In 1909, the last of the 7 Piper children was born. She was a petite and beautiful girl. They named her after her mother, Ada Jane Piper. Farm life was hard work, and the children were expected to help out. Prairie weather is extreme. Summers are hot, and winters can be severe. One longtime intimate of Ada's agreed, under specific conditions, to share the stories she told him.
Ada told me that she remembers one winter when it was very, very cold, and food was scarce for the animals, and the moose in the woods were so hungry that they would come out of the woods and eat the hay right off the wagon.
The farm wasn't the life for Ada. As a teen, she started running away. The RCMP always brought her back. Ada had worked hard and saved her pennies. She wanted to buy a pair of shiny red shoes. When her father and older sister went to town for supplies, Ada trusted them with her money for the shoes. They returned with footwear more appropriate for farm work. This time, when Ada ran away, the Mounties couldn't find her. She was the youngest child, yet the first to leave home. Ada was 14. For a while, she worked as a nanny for family friends in Winnipeg. After that, what was she to do for a living?
She was telling me the story about the winters there in the western cities, of course, being so cold, and the girls would be working on the street. And what they did to attract business, they wore large fur muffs on their hands, but inside the muffs they would have little dogs. And when they saw a potential customer coming along the street, they would let the dog's head stick out of the muff, and the customer would pat the dog's head, and they would make a little deal, and everything looked very innocent to any passerby.
In all likelihood, Ada became one of the women in her story. During the early 1930s, Canada sank beneath a Great Depression. Later, the droughts of the mid-30s turned the prairies to dust. It's likely that Ada sent money home to help. She was generous to her family throughout her life. There was global unemployment. Ada made her living as best she could from the streets of Winnipeg. Young and attractive, she worked in a business where these traits were rewarded.
Physically, she probably would have weighed about 98 pounds. Very well built. Probably built like a partridge in a sense. All her meat was on her breast, but...
The young Ada moved around. After Winnipeg, several cities in Ontario. She told stories about living in Chicago, although there is no record of a residency there. Port Arthur, Ontario became her home for a while. Reportedly, she was arrested there on prostitution-related charges. The only reference in the papers of the day made no mention of Ada.
He said the men walking along the street were bothered by women in the house.
No doubt marriage was an appealing alternative to working the streets. The first marriage didn't last long. Her new husband, Mr. Larking, died in a tragic accident less than 2 weeks after their wedding. In 1940, Ada married again, to James Bryce Fraser. They lived in Winnipeg, where Mr. Fraser was a machinist with the Canadian National Railway. When the couple moved to Vancouver in 1942, he joined the Navy. Immediately, he was posted to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and Ada followed in the spring of 1942. Ada's husband shipped out with the Navy, and when he came back that fall, they separated. Perhaps he wasn't the most savory of characters. Ada had a choice: to go back to the life on the streets or to assume a new role in the oldest profession. For an enterprising young woman left without a means of support, Halifax could offer a bounty of wealth. After all, Halifax had a trollop street. Like a magnet, Halifax held this enterprising woman. It was 1942. Halifax offered the second biggest harbor in the world. Convoys of tankers, merchant ships, and Navy vessels gathered here, bound for overseas. There was a decent dollar to be made in the gateway to the world, as Halifax was called then. Ships filling the Bedford Basin en route to the war were outfitted with supplies, munitions, and men.
Well, the city was not a good place to live in. There were more service people in Halifax than there were civilians who lived here. And the result was that every facility in this city was crowded to capacity. And an ordinary person who lived in Halifax never ventured to go to a show, couldn't go to a restaurant, because they were all occupied and filled up with service personnel. And so life was difficult and very different in Halifax during the war years.
At 33 years of age, Ada was past earning top dollar. At what point did she assume a management position in the sex trade? When did she evolve from a miss to a madam?
Ada was a very sharp-looking woman and sophisticated. Nice talking, smooth, but very strict with her girls. Very strict. She didn't take no fooling around of any kind.
Very soft-spoken, really. She wasn't a madame of the type that was, with a loud language and actions. She was a very modest woman, and as I say, a very nice-looking woman at that time.
When I was asking her once about her being in the business, she said it's been years since she turned a trick, and this was around 1963, she told me this. And she said, she just got out of that business and was doing the administration, although she always had boyfriends or men admirers.
When Richard Donahoe was fresh out of law school, he became a lawyer to a madam whose name was Germaine Pelletier. Germaine was Ada's predecessor.
The act which constitutes prostitution was not illegal. There's nothing to say that I can't have sexual intercourse with anybody. And if I do, there's nothing that makes it illegal. It may be morally wrong, it may be quite improper from a marital point of view, but as far as the law was concerned, but the law said that that kind of activity could not be carried on as a business.
Germaine operated a body house, meaning that the women lived in the house and provided the service there. Germaine was frequently busted and was tried and charged. When Germaine died during the war, Ada took over the house. It was at 51 Hollis Street. She continued to operate it as a body house. But Ada learned an important lesson from Germaine. Because the law was so clear about the illegality of a body house, at some point Ada would need to find a workable alternative. Richard Donahoe's son also became a lawyer. Terry inherited the city's next prominent madam, Ada McCallum. He remembers the stories the older lawyers told.
During the war, near the end of the war, the women engaged in the profession would traipse around town in these big high white boots, and when these women were seen in the boots, they were immediately identified as her girls, and that was sort of a hallmark or a trademark. That got to be a little bit of a problem for many others in the community, because there was a period through some of this time where these high white boots came to be in vogue for everybody in the community, and a number of them were accosted and propositioned with people thinking that they were in the sex trade.
Sorry. I thought you were hey, lady.
40 years later, a book about prostitution in Halifax was titled White Boots. Now we know why. Even though the house at 51 Hollis Street has been destroyed, the stories will not go away. Lineups of men outside the Hollis Street house stretched all the way down the street to the Hotel Nova Scotian. Sailors stopping off in Halifax on their way overseas boasted, "I'm gonna die at 51.
The clients went upstairs, and she mentioned about one morning, approximately 6:30 in the morning, and Ada was in the kitchen washing the teacups, and this little French girl came into the kitchen to help her, and Ada said, "Look, Suzette, you've worked hard all day. You must be very tired." And Suzette replied, "Well, I'm not tired. I'm sore, right in the bottom of my feet from running up and down stairs."
One of the Canadian Navy sailors was a tall and handsome man from Saskatchewan, Hector McCallum. He showed up in Halifax during the war. The madam met the sailor, but they'd have to wait. Even though she was separated at the time, Ada was still legally married. In addition to Ada's business, the community set up private clubs and dry canteens to accommodate the servicemen during wartime.
Hundreds of them were roaming the streets of Halifax looking for a drink and no place to get one. There were no bars or saloons or taverns in those days, and so the only way you could get a drink was from the Liquor Commission.
The thousands of servicemen felt trapped in Halifax, far from the action and not yet discharged to go home. Their frustration erupted into riots on VE Day in 1945.
When they went to the Liquor Commission, they found them closed, and at a certain point, some rioter said, "Let's break in," and they broke in, and from then on, all hell was loose.
The story goes that those who weren't rioting were at Ada's. She had a promising future, so why did she feel she had to make her life more complicated? What made her want to marry? To adopt a child? To take over caring for her aging mother? The end of the war signaled a new beginning for Ada. She wanted a divorce from James Fraser. By now, Mr. Fraser was serving time in a penitentiary in Manitoba. Her lawyer told her to go to Reno, Nevada. Ada waited out the 6 weeks to gain residency status and got her divorce. The very next day, Ada married Hector McCallum. The newlyweds moved back to Halifax. Hector set himself up in a trucking business, then a restaurant. The couple relocated many times to Tobin Street and Grafton Street. But Ada was not content to sit at home as the pretty little wife. She bought a downtown hotel called the Morris Lodge. Perhaps still smarting from the riots, Halifax tried to control social activities and drinking. In those days, there were 3 bars, for men only. Ada renovated Morris Lodge. It was one of the few establishments to be granted a drinking license. Doug Harkness was one of the young journalists who visited Ada at the Morris Lodge. His rowdy crowd was referred to as the Brat Pack.
Well, those were days, probably a lot of people would forget them, but they're days when the liquor laws hadn't been really relaxed in Nova Scotia. There were a few taverns, just a few, and the only other place you could get drinks were at private clubs or at hotel restaurants. And she ran the Morris Lodge, and it was a restaurant, and Basically, on Sunday afternoon, it was the place that you went to drink, the stevedores and the media and what have you. And what you had was a 3-course dinner. You had your tomato juice, and you had your roll, and you had what I call a rubber sandwich. Nobody ever ate the sandwich, but it gave you 3 courses, and as long as you had that, you could drink all day.
The building that housed Morris Lodge is no longer here, but the people who remember still are. Ron McDonald was a cub reporter then. His friendship with Ada started in those days at the lodge.
Ada and myself became friends from 1963 to 1975, I believe, in that area especially. And no matter what establishment she was in, I could go in at any time of the day and night, and we'd sit there, we'd play crib. She had a collection of Royal Daltons, over 200 of them, which she would entrust me to clean with her, and she wouldn't trust anybody else. And we would go through those and decide if there were other activities, I'm sure, that I was involved in those days.
Rumor has it that Ada lost most of her collection of Royal Daltons to a prominent politician one night in a card game. Ada's family in Manitoba thought highly of her. As far as they knew, she was running a successful hotel. When Ada heard that her mother was being neglected in a nursing home, she bought her a first-class berth on the train to Halifax. A body house was a strange environment for an old woman to live out her days. According to some, the elderly lady expressed surprise at how popular her daughter was, how many male callers she had, and frequently, the gentleman brought her flowers.
Mrs. Piper, Ada's mother, lived at the Morris Lodge for a while. She had a room there, and when rooms were scarce, I understand, Ada told me at one time, they even doubled up.
At the age of 44, Ada had a husband and her mother living with her, and a successful business running the lodge. But there was an emptiness in her life that could no longer be denied. Ada went to an adoption home to adopt a baby. It was 1953. She was distracted by an infant who was crying incessantly. Ada was told that the boy was sick and hadn't been able to eat for several days. She decided this was the baby she wanted. The agency wouldn't let her take him. Wait until tomorrow to see if he survives the night. But Ada insisted on taking the baby. Hector was left to run the business, while Ada nursed the baby back to health.
I knew Gary from the time he was a small fellow. He was a temperamental little fella, and not very much addicted to schoolwork. Ada trusted him, and implicitly, and they had a very good relationship themselves.
Jimmy Gillis worked as a bellhop, a boxer, and a bartender. Now he owns his own bar in New Brunswick. He remembers the way Ada explained to her young son the house full of girls.
Because he used to ask questions when he was younger, why all the girls were in the house. And she told him the story that they were sales ladies selling perfume and jewelry. And he thought when they went out, that's what they were doing, selling perfume and jewelry.
The girls liked Ada. They had good living quarters. They were protected in as much as she always had a taxi driver or a steady driver for them. Certainly there was, in some ways, she was a pimp, but not in the way what we hear of today that are continually taking the money from the girls. The girls came on a 60-40 split, and they had their food and they had their beds. They were looked after. Nobody harassed them.
Walter Borden worked as a night clerk at a hotel which provided foreign fishermen with a room for the night and a woman to share it with.
There was a lady at McGill, but she was in medicine. There was a nurse that was in her final year, and they explained very carefully, look, they said, look, we take this job, and this is how much money we make. The lady who was going to law, she had owed no money in university, had the money to open her own office, and I would listen to this. And this was just not stories, this was so.
But Ada was very strict with her girls, very strict. They weren't allowed to go shopping, or she'd go with them in the daytime. There weren't no nightlife for them at all. They were there strictly for business. And she flew them out from Montreal, Toronto.
These girls were not garish in dress. You know, you'd meet them in the mall or in a store, and you'd never know who they were, unless you seen them walking in a motel or a hotel at 3 o'clock in the morning. Then you sort of query a little bit.
I am not naive at all. I understand fully the downside, the horrible side of this life as the hooker. The thing was, I met a group of ladies who chose to do what they were doing and were working in an organization that, although they might not be what you or so-and-so and so-and-so would consider to be an ethical set of rules, were highly ethical.
Meanwhile, Hector became less interested in running the business with Ada and more interested in gambling. But he charged his debts back to Morris Lodge. By the mid-50s, the couple separated. Divorce proceedings began in 1957. This time, Ada had good legal representation. The grounds for divorce? Since James Fraser had never been served papers, he and Ada were still married, in spite of the Reno divorce. So, Hector and Ada's marriage was declared null and void. Fraser was, by this time, in the Kingston Penitentiary. Ada was learning important lessons. Marriage and divorce can be costly, and always get the best legal advice.
The lawyer will represent the man or woman who comes to him or her for representation on the theory that they're innocent until proven guilty. If she did, as she did on a few occasions, conduct herself in such a way as to justify a conviction and the penalty that flows, then so be it. But the fact that she was engaged in that particular business didn't, in my mind, and shouldn't, in my mind, disqualify her from having able representation. And beside that, she was a very, very interesting client and an interesting woman, and sure paid her bills on times.
Some blame Ada's loss of the Morris Lodge on Hector's bad debts. Whatever the reason, Ada lost the property. Without a husband in her life, Ada showed her own resourcefulness. She evolved a call girl operation. The nature of this business was less obvious to the upholders of the law. She formed alliances with the powerful and influential. People thought twice before tangling with a woman like Ada.
I think that she was a hell of a businesswoman, a professional businesswoman. I think that she would be the type of woman that maybe she didn't have the education, but if say, she did have the education, that she could go into any place and take over as management. She would be, I would say she would be management status.
She had an aura about her of brains. She was the top banana in that bunch, and she knew it. And she knew how to handle herself with anyone. She was one of the smartest women I've ever met in my life, if not perhaps the smartest person.
She wasn't very bright when it came to playing cards. She didn't bet well, and she had difficulty counting the points and things like that when we played cribbage. She obviously knew what she was doing in her line of business.
As with any good business manager, Ada knew she had to hire the best. An accountant helped her set up a simple, single-entry accounting system, which she described years later in court. This kept Revenue Canada off her back for a while. Still living in Halifax, Hector was gambling and drinking so heavily that her friends told Ada she should help him out. She set him up with a restaurant, but when he lost interest, the business failed. After the loss of Morris Lodge, Ada ran her call girl operation from this house on Russell Street. For the rest of her career, she chose houses that were by nature inconspicuous, in residential neighborhoods. Who would suspect the business these houses harbored? Ada's poor old mother had a fall down the stairs and died shortly afterwards in hospital. Her grave is next to where her daughter would be buried almost 30 years later. By now, Ada's son had reached the age of knowing the nature of his mother's business. At first, Ada sent him to school in Cape Breton. Later, she used her influence to get him into a respected school.
When her son wished to get into King's Collegiate, which was a rather snob Grecism to get in there, she was able to get her son in, even though his marks weren't that great, and his academic record in public school was not that great. But she got him in, and she paid the price, for his courses there and everything. But very few others could have gotten in at that time.
Bernie Robichaud worked as a beat cop. He left the police to become a taxi driver and later a dispatcher.
She had her own driver to drive the girls around. And he used to pick them up, drop them off to their destination, and then go back and wait for them and take them back to the apartment.
Bellhops and bartenders would get a tip for referring customers to Ada's service.
I was the bellhop at the old Resident Arms Hotel. One of her drivers come in, young fella, and give me her name and phone number in case they need a customer staying at the hotel with like a company. And then the driver wanted to go on a vacation for a week or so. And then I used to go from 11 at night to 4 in the morning and drive the girls from hotel to hotel. They used to pay me every Friday night at about 4 in the morning when they were through. And each girl would give me $25. Ada would pay me $50. And one night I was coming across the bridge, going, they lived on North Street at the time in Dartmouth, and this little Newfoundlander one was playing with her $25, and she really didn't want to part with it. She says, Jimmy, you sure you don't want a little trick for this? I said, no, thank you, darling. I just drove you around all night to about a dozen or more places. I don't need this. Give me the $25, please, and thank you.
The next house, on Windsor Street, became Ada's home for many years. Understandably, the current residents don't want the exterior of the house shown.
The people who were at Ada's place, for the most part, were people that she had befriended and dropped in, and it sort of used to be an in place to go. Sometimes there'd be many 6 or 7 people in her living room talking. A lot of them were, well-known figures in the Halifax scene, I must say. They'd be very well-known on television and radio and civic politics and federal politics and provincial judges and what have you.
The politicians that were involved with Ada usually would send in or phone in, and they would, especially provincial politicians who were from out of town, they all had either apartments or places that girls could be sent, and certainly they were. She was basically, I believe, a conservative, and she would give perhaps $1,000 before an election to the Conservative Party. Now, I'm sure she gave some to the Liberal Party, but I can't account for that. Ada was a free enterpriser, and there was no way she was going to give to the NDP or the CCF in any way.
Well, she certainly knew a lot of politicians and knew them well. She was always invited to the Lieutenant Governor's garden party, although I don't believe she ever went, but the invitation was always there for her.
When I was driving cab, you hear all kinds of stories, and if you can believe 10% of what a cab driver tells you, you can cut that in half. And then maybe take that to the bank. You might get a cup of coffee, but you're not going to get any more than that.
Well, you heard stories where, some of these people that played cards there would, sign checks. And so she had, checks made out to her from various individuals, whose reputations could be, I suppose, ruined if it was known. And so that was sort of an insurance policy, for her.
Like she could say, she kept them. It was anybody that ever took her never talked nothing other than going there to play cards. That was it.
Hi. How are you? Thanks for letting me come. Good.
Elizabeth Green Havens was new to Halifax when she went searching for a house to buy in the early 70s.
Oh, my.
She hadn't yet heard of Ada.
A lot of memories and a lot of changes. It looks great. The first time I came here, the curtains were drawn. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and there were 3 women sitting in a semicircle watching television. And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry to disturb you while you're entertaining." Well, she just twinkled.
The Windsor Street house was put up for sale after a Jehovah's Witness church was constructed nearby. According to some, at first the neighbors circulated a petition to keep the church from moving into their neighborhood. Ada wouldn't sign it. She felt people should be allowed to live or have a church where they wanted. After the church was built, its parishioners sent a petition around the neighborhood trying to get Ada to leave. None of the neighbors would sign.
One morning when she was going to bed, that she was lying in bed about 8:30 in the morning. She hadn't been asleep yet. And the children were going to school. And she said they were making quite a racket outside of her bedroom window. And then she said one of the children said, "Shh, don't wake up the whores." So obviously everybody knew she lived there.
I had no idea about the background of this place at all. And when we first arrived at the door, I met this charming, dark hair going gray, probably in her 50s, brown eyes, and these wonderful laugh lines. I came back again, and I guess it was largely because I hadn't been in the living room. Ada opened the door and twinkled at me, and I knew that she knew that I knew. But I think that's why we got a good price. Oh, I love the detail on these stairs. Yes, there it is. That's the original wallpaper. I never would have picked it for myself, but I liked it. I lived with it for a whole year. It made me feel exotic.
The location of Ada's house was perhaps the worst kept secret in the city. There was disagreement about how Ada's name was spelt, but everyone knew her telephone number. Kevin Keefe owns Halifax's Granite Brewery.
I remember flying somewhere in Canada. I was on a plane and sitting chatting to the fellow beside me, and when he found out I was from Halifax, he asked me if I knew Ada, and I said, "Oh, I know of her," and so he started waxing eloquent about how wonderful she was and what a wonderful service she had, and then he said, "Look," and he pulled out his wallet and leafed through it and pulled out an old tattered business card. It was like Bob's Plumbing and Heating or something like that. And on the back of it, he had a bunch of numbers written like an addition, you know, like 422 plus 3794 equals this. He said, "That's Ada's phone number, you know, 422 3794 or whatever." And he says, "So I do it like that so my wife won't, you know, if she ever finds this card and phones that number, you know."
Silver Donald Cameron is a prominent writer and storyteller.
In 1972, if you wanted a divorce, you could either wait for 3 years and you could get an irreconcilable breakdown of marriage, but if you wanted a divorce in less time than that, the only ground that was acceptable was adultery. And my ex-wife and I wanted to get it over and done with, so my lawyer said, "Well, look, get a hotel room, hire a prostitute, get some witness to come in and catch you in flagrante delicto," the lovely legal term for being caught naked in bed with a woman. I called Ada, and she was very businesslike and very helpful, explained to her my problems. She thought she could do something to help me out. So we made an arrangement to a particular evening in the Dresden Arms Hotel that she would send up a girl to me. Meantime, I made an arrangement with a witness to be outside in the bushes with his date, actually. It had to happen fairly quickly because he had other commitments in the evening. And in due course, along came the girl. And she said, "When your friend comes in here, is he going to take pictures?" And I said, "No pictures either. He just has to catch us together." Well, she said, "That's good because I'm married too and I don't want a divorce and the pictures could cause me a lot of trouble." And I said, no pictures and so forth. And drew the curtains and my friend came up and came in the room and we exchanged a few embarrassed words and he was able to go off and testify later on that he had indeed found me in flagrante delicto in a hotel room in Halifax, and thus we got the divorce.
She made a good living from men's pocketbooks, and they were her closest friends. Apparently, she picked her friends well. They knew their secrets were safe with her.
The first thing that comes to my mind when I think about Ada is her discretion. She ran a business that she knew was skirting the law. She knew that there was a possibility of people, in some cases, people of some so-called substance or rank in the community being hurt if discretion wasn't exercised at every turn, and she made sure it was.
Once she had a fact, she had to zip her mouth and she would never talk about somebody behind their back. She was completely closed-mouthed, as that business warranted. And in fact, where she took checks from close friends, and if the police were coming of her raid, that she'd rather tear them up than let them fall in their hands, even though it meant a loss of hundreds and hundreds of dollars to her. She had a liaison with the police hierarchy, and I don't think that they were sort of on the take or anything, but certainly they knew of her activities, but she ran a good business, and they were not about to step in and ruin it.
Ronald Grantham worked 35 years with the Halifax Police Department, most recently as an inspector.
You know, a lot of people wondered why Ada wasn't put out of business. We had other things which we felt were more important because of the violence attached to the operations. She had a non-violent operation. It was illegal. And perhaps if we had more time and more money and more manpower, she would have been closed down, but she would have resurfaced someplace else. When she was raided, she knew the jig was up. She didn't really cooperate as far as, telling us everything we wanted to know, but at the same time, she wasn't rude, she wasn't disrespectful, and she knew that her time had come, and that was it.
Ada, as well, had a tribute which she was exacted every year by the city of Halifax, and usually the police chief or something would probably let it be known that she was about due for a raid, and she could clean up her books and get the records hidden.
No, that's definitely not true, because she was surprised, believe me.
And then there would be a raid, and she would be fined an obligatory $1,000 a year. And she would, when I would ask her about it, she would say, well, I just paid my dues, or she sometimes referred to it euphemistically as pussy tax.
In all, Ada was charged and convicted 7 times in prostitution-related offenses.
I never once in all the time heard the name of anybody who was of the opposite sex who patronized the place. I always thought that was a little cruel and a little hard, because in my view, the patrons of the place were more responsible for what was going on than the girls who served them.
It is ironic that a woman who was fined for operating an illegal business was still expected to pay taxes. Ada was getting on in years when she was investigated by Revenue Canada for income tax evasion in the late 70s.
I don't know what kind of volume of business that she did, but I would suggest it was in $250,000 a year.
She must have amassed a lot of money. I know that there were a lot of expenses in the transportation of her girls flying them back to Montreal. I heard that she had purchased property and that she had subdivided, and she sold that as building lots. But the rumor was that she named some of the streets after her girls. It's a mystery.
The call girl operation earned Ada a good living and notoriety, whether she wanted it or not. It wasn't always a smooth sail. Halifax is a port city. The waters are not always calm.
She knew it was illegal. So did the people that used her services know it was illegal. Hey, maybe that's part of the fun. I don't know.
In her later years, Ada hid money in her house, in walls and under mattresses. Her suspicion of banks may have been a result of having had an account seized by Revenue Canada. Because of a steep fine from Revenue Canada, she filed for personal bankruptcy in 1981. Ada wasn't all business. There are many stories about her generosity to employees, family, and friends.
She entrusted me time and again to get money to charities in which she did not want to be connected. And I would make the contact, and it would come in as anonymous. She didn't want her name connected with it in any way, because she thought that the money might have some stain to it that might not have been approved of by the people who were running the charity.
I think maybe one of Ada's weaknesses was, she was a very generous person. I think some people took advantage of her and borrowed money from her that they didn't repay and what have you.
Ada's big weakness is that she listened to people without being able to get out and enjoy herself at all. The thing that I could never understand is that she existed as long as she did, smoking 3 to 5 packs of cigarettes every day, and her voice was even turning over the ears into a very guttural response every time she would speak, and when she was on the phone, she would be just rasping it out. She worked 7 days a week. She would get up around 11, 12 in the midday, and she would be there till 5 in the morning. And she would be on the phone. She ate terribly. Her eating was just abysmal. I mean, she was eating sort of half junk food and half sandwiches and half this and half that. And she got very little exercise. But otherwise, in temperament, to me, she was marvelous. I always admired her, and I still do to this day.
Shadows of her past plagued her, concerns that she may be busted.
When you visited her, you had to arrive within a minute or two of the time you would say you would arrive there, because she would be watching behind a curtain to open the door for you. And that was quite a procedure too, because the doors were reinforced with iron bars, or at least iron latches with wooden bars across the doors. And the reason she did that is because somebody did break in one time in her Dartmouth dwelling, and they tied her up and gagged her and searched the house. And that's why she was so careful, and that is why she acquired a watchdog. During those years, she told me that there were less than a handful of people who visited her at her house. Myself, the bookkeeper, the veterinarian, perhaps the cabinet minister.
After years of suffering from emphysema, Ada died at the Dartmouth General Hospital on November 15th, 1986. Her son never abandoned her. Ada and Gary were always close. This was even reported in the newspaper.
I was hired to cover a local visiting dignitary, a politician visiting town, and one of the stops happened to be the Halifax Club. At lunchtime, word came that Ada had died. So all the cream of the Nova Scotia crop raised their glass of sherry or whiskey or whatever it was and toasted the memory of Ada. And it was obvious that quite a few of them had availed themselves of Ada's services at one time or another.
She was a great woman and an interesting character, and provided a service that if she wasn't engaged in it, somebody else would have done less well. Simple as that.
Who would have thought that a madam would have regional coverage on the CBC?
She was the local madam, but I think she was so with a great deal of feeling and respect. I don't think she hurt anybody. And from what I understand and the stories I hear, everybody speaks of her kindly, with a chuckle, with a laugh, and with a great deal of respect in spite of the business that she carried on.
In spite of how wide she flung her net, despite the many clients who used her services, the decades of friends who socialized with her at her house, less than 20 attended her burial. Rumors about reporters and cameras kept people away. During Ada's reign, Halifax grew from a small provincial town to a mature international port city. It evolved culturally, became more cosmopolitan. Since Ada's death, there has been no business which has rivaled Ada's class act. She epitomized the spirit of a city wherein colorful personalities can become legends.